Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. As part of a comprehensive news analysis, today we'll be discussing 6 important articles out of the Hindu Newspaper Daily Edition. Good morning to all of you. Before we begin, these are the 6 topics we are going to cover today. First, we'll discuss the concept of NATO Plus and how India should not fall into that trap. Thereafter, the Paris Climate Agreement with regards to Dubai is coming in December. We have to discuss the concept of just transition. Then a very interesting word which is coming out of the US, and we have to discuss what is this greedflation, something which is more politically oriented, but we have to discuss what is this word. Thereafter, we'll talk about how we are using the Chinese currency yuan to pay to the Russians, a very interesting angle in the larger Russia-Ukraine crisis. Thereafter, we now know that it was human error and the report has been finally submitted with regards to Balasore incident. And last but not the least, the ongoing saga of the 2000 rupee note and how much has come back to the RBI as a part of sweeping the economy out of this very high denomination note. So let's begin our first topic or analysis with the concept of NATO, NATO Plus, and the very simple what we call as temptation to go and become part of NATO, as the US is ready to add it to the NATO Plus concept itself. So as always, we'll talk about the basic points first and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of the topic itself. So we know that recently the United States Permanent Representative to NATO has said that we are open to expand in NATO, and specifically we are ready to engage with India, and India can be added to the NATO under the concept of NATO Plus. Now first we need to understand two basic things. What is NATO, which is North Atlantic Treaty Organization? What is NATO Plus? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? Now, the history of the NATO is very straightforward. If you've done world history, you would know that it comes out of the post-Second World War, Cold War politics itself. Its basic pretext is when the Berlin blockade is created by Stalin in order to take East Berlin itself. When the Berlin airlift starts, in which the Western powers are able to undermine the Berlin blockade itself, there is a response from Stalin, from USSR, in the form of their first nuclear test in 1949. And once they became the second important nuclear power, because till 1949, US was the only nuclear power in the world. Once the USSR gets nuclear power, that creates a panic in the West specifically, and thereafter it is in this context of the Berlin blockade and the first nuclear test of USSR that we see the Brussels Defense Treaty, which automatically becomes or evolves into what we call as North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is seen as a very strategic concept. Now NATO has two basic principles which you need to understand, which is first the concept of collective security, wherein if you attack any NATO member, you're attacking all of them, therefore they will respond together. On the second hand, there is this second principle which is called the joint command concept, wherein all the NATO countries actually contribute to the NATO forces, which is a joint command for all these countries. In that sense, their defense in a way in a specific sector is decided collectively. So NATO is about collective security, NATO is about joint command, is about joint action and joint decisions when it comes to certain defense actions. Now, the countries which today are part of NATO, 30 countries are there, 31st has recently been added, which is Finland on April 2023. So if you look at it, except for the US and Canada, most of the European countries after the Cold War politics, thereafter the disintegration of the USSR, except for Ukraine, which had been crying to be part of NATO for a very long time, it was not given access, but most of the countries in Europe specifically are part of NATO, therefore giving them this collective security concept. As it is, Europe was the one where the First World War and the Second World War started, so there was this basic urge to have a joint command, a joint force, a joint decision-making body where all countries can come together, and the suspicion was also high. Therefore, the concept of the West and the East, and specifically the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, the so-called Iron Curtain as Churchill called it, was there for a very, very long time till 1991. And NATO is basically based on this basic, it started as a fear of socialism, as a fear of communism, as a fear of USSR, and has now evolved into a fear of China, and somehow the old adversary is back, which is Russia. So we know what is NATO. NATO is proper static in that regard. There's a lot of what we call as push and pull right now happening between Sweden and Turkey also over entry of Sweden into NATO. We don't have to go into that. But the basic point is these 31 countries together have a concept of joint command, have a concept of joint decision making, and a concept of collective security. This is proper static international relations for you. Now we have to see what is this concept of NATO plus. See, the original concept of NATO is quite European, or what we call as Europe and America centric, or America Canada centric. And over the years, the conflict zones have shifted away from Europe, which used to be a major hotbed, specifically East and Western Germany before the unification. And now that has moved away from the European sector to the South China Sea, to the Yellow Sea, to the Indo-Pacific as it is called. Now, in the Indo-Pacific, the NATO needs strategic partners. So, though it is not an institutionalized concept, though it is not something which has been actually written down, it is not based on anything like that. It's just a concept within NATO itself, wherein they want to engage with better alliance partners. They evolved a concept called NATO plus. NATO plus is nothing but NATO countries plus America's very important strategic partners across the globe, specifically in Asia. So you have Australia, you have New Zealand, you have South Korea, you have Japan, and one more very important creditor of the American, Israel. Together, this is called NATO plus. NATO plus Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan and Israel. Now, what the Americans are arguing, what NATO is arguing as of right now, is that we want to add India into this concept of NATO plus, and we are even open to have India as a strategic partner in NATO in some way or the other. So, India's importance in the larger defense story is becoming more and more important, and it is because now NATO's basic adversary is not USSR, it does not exist, it is rather China. So it's about balancing China, and therefore India has been given this bait, has been given this offer that why not become a part of the NATO or NATO plus concept. NATO plus is just a very loose concept. But NATO is a proper, you have to sign it, you have to ratify it, you have to become a partner within the NATO concept, you have to then contribute also in the NATO budget itself, which Trump did not like, and there was a lot of what we call as tensions which Trump developed previously when he said that I'm going to cut the budget of the NATO, separate issue altogether. Now, we need to understand as UPSC aspirants, and what this article also talks about, is the advantage and disadvantage of this. So, NATO, NATO plus, two things I have discussed with you. These are clear. Wherein, what is NATO, the context in which NATO comes in, and what is the concept of NATO plus. If these two things are clear, then we will move to the advantage and disadvantage if India does want to be a partner in the NATO concept. Great. Perfect. So, let's then discuss the advantage and disadvantage. See. Now, when we talk about the advantages of, for example, becoming a part of the NATO or becoming a part of NATO plus, we get strategic importance, because at the end of the day, we become partners in this larger, what we call as pan-European concept of NATO, and it will give India strategic importance in the larger story, specifically in what we call as Indo-Pacific and in the Indian Ocean world itself. Thereafter, we get access to modern technology and a lot of equipment which we don't have access to. For example, Eurofighter Typhoon, a very specific thing which has been developed by the NATO for Europe itself. Thereafter, it also allows us what we call as better defense equipment strategy and framework, because India then becomes this part of this collective security. And in that sense, it becomes important as a partner in the larger narrative of NATO and in the Indo-Pacific generally. So if you look at it, the advantage is basically technological access and being part of this organization which has been there since 1949 and is important in the larger narrative of the world. However, what we see is that the disadvantages actually outweigh the advantages. Now, what are the disadvantages? As soon as we become part of NATO, Russia will actually pivot away from India very quickly. And as much as we had NAM, which is non-alignment movement, as much as we did not take sides when it came to Cold War politics, India was always held by Russia, be it the Chinese crisis, be it the Pakistan war. Every time, 65, every time, Russia has been, USSR previously has been standing for India. So we call Russia an all-weather friend, and therefore Russia would very quickly pivot away. Even in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, India has taken an ambiguous stance which has allowed Russia to give us a lot of oil, and in that sense, Russia is a country which has been helping us, and we would very quickly disassociate, or Russia would disassociate from India. Because for Russia, NATO represents a reminiscence of the past which led to its disintegration. It reminds it of the Second World War, it reminds it of the Cold War politics. Now, the more concerning aspect here are the next two issues. The concept of China being countered via NATO, if we go under NATO command or if we go under any organization where there is NATO presence, our decision-making power goes away. Because if there is certain action we need to take, for example, in Ladakh, we have to take certain action in Arunachal Pradesh. The problem will be that India would then have to go to the NATO command, join NATO command, get a sanction, get certain kind of decision-making agreement, and thereafter India could act. This, in a way, undermines the autonomy of Indian defense and foreign policy. And this is a very, very important point you need to understand, wherein we have actually a lot to lose if we actually become a part of NATO. Because we lose our own decision-making power, we will always be then slave to this concept that we have to get an approval from the US in a way, because NATO is controlled by the US, and our own autonomy when it comes to our own foreign policy and defense policy goes away. And as of right now, India has always had this what is called strategic advantage, and that strategic advantage is called all alignment. We previously were non-alignment. Now we are all alignment. This has been introduced by a now foreign minister, which is that we will align with everybody. We will develop an independent relationship with everyone. Russia and US are in tension, but we don't have any issues. You don't want to trade with this country, we will trade with that country. India has moved towards all alignment, and therefore it is important that we do not get caught up in the story related to this NATO politics itself. So when we talk about Russia, our all-weather friend goes away. Further, the Chinese action, if we talk about Pakistan aggression, if we talk about China aggression, anything, we would then become slaves to decision-making powers of the NATO, and our autonomy when it comes to how we engage with the world, our sovereignty itself, in a way, gets undermined by becoming part of the NATO or NATO Plus program. And this is what this basic thing says, that India should refuse America's NATO Plus bait, which is India should not become a part of the NATO or should not even engage with the NATO. And our foreign minister has been very, very clear that NATO doesn't work for us. And he's very straightforward in saying we don't want to be part of the NATO itself. So there are three things which we've discussed. First, NATO, NATO Plus. I think you understand that. Thereafter, we've now discussed and understood the concept of advantage, military access, new technology, collective command, strategic position. Disadvantage, Russia leaves us. Thereafter, we have no autonomy when it comes to our defense and foreign policy. And over and above that, we also cannot act independently, which is equally dangerous when it comes to sovereignty of a country. Is this clear? Yes? Simple points, but interesting points. A realistic question in GS paper 2 in that sense. Okay, perfect. So let's talk about the nitty-gritty. NATO, as we know, is a transatlantic military alliance or an organization of 31 countries. It has its origins in the Cold War politics and against the Soviet Union itself. 31st member recently joined, Sweden is waiting. and people believe that Russia-Ukraine crisis in a way has given a breath of fresh air to the NATO. NATO has become again relevant. People thought that NATO will become irrelevant after Cold War politics or once the USSR disintegrated. But we believe that Cold War 2.0 is on. The Iron Curtain again has fallen on Europe. And NATO as of right now is mostly controlling what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine is getting most of its equipment from NATO. And further, NATO and Russia, that old narrative is again back. So we believe that Cold War politics did not go anywhere, but the issue has now turned away from communism and socialism to now Russia's place in history, where it wants to take back its position, and Putin's basic ambition to be or to take Ukraine and its very important natural resources, which is also backfiring now in the long run. Now, when we talk about NATO plus, it refers to NATO plus 5 very important strategic partners of the US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, and South Korea. And it's a global defense cooperation, and it is about strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is not officially recognized. It is not something as a concept within NATO itself. It's just a potential alliance which people talk about. Now, NATO previously targeted the Soviet Union, USSR. Now it is targeting China, and therefore India has both advantages and disadvantages of being in this story. The simple point is, positives would be, as we already know, it's an increasing security challenge, and we would get access to a lot of different equipment which we don't have access to. India joining the NATO plus will give us that umbrella of security which India in a way needs also. It will give us access to military technology, intelligence, shared platforms, interportability, which India is also getting. Thereafter, it strengthens India's defense capabilities, but we need to assess this vis-a-vis the disadvantages. And the disadvantages are much bigger. First is, it is basically to annoy Russia and China. We don't care if you're annoying China, but annoying Russia is problematic because we have an all-weather robust relationship with Russia. Even as we see in the Ukraine war, Moscow is dependent and is a valuable member of Indian defense strategy and foreign policy, and therefore very quickly Russia would abandon us, and that is not good because, as we know and as I've always said in different platforms, America is a moody power. It is a very, very moody power. Today it will say NATO plus, we are brothers, everything is perfect. Tomorrow it will say, who are you? We don't know. That is the problem with US. Russia has not been like that. On the other hand, the second and the third are actually more serious, wherein though China is a common link between NATO and India, if we become part of the NATO story, the problem is that we do not get a independent military framework in which India can independently act, as we did in Pongangso, as we did in the Galwan Valley, as we are doing in Arunachal, which is to have independent action, and the decision making should be in Indian hands. And on the second part, and that is the more problematic one, it takes away our strategic autonomy. Because as of right now, India wants to engage with everybody. All alignment is the basic motto as of right now. And therefore, if we go into a NATO framework, that gets undermined. So, we already have understood the advantages and disadvantages. And I hope you understand out of this basic article that we should not and we should not fall for this NATO called lollipop, because it will only take away too much out of Indian sovereignty and strategic importance and independent decision making. If this is clear, we'll move to the second one. Yes? Okay, perfect. Yes, sir. Great. Now, the second topic is equally interesting, and it's about the Global Stocktake, which is going to happen in December, and the COP28 is going to meet in Dubai in December. But the last major moment in which the climate change conference happened was at Bonn. So we know that the Bonn Climate Change Conference introduced a lot of concepts within the larger 1.5 degree, keeping it below 1.5 degree. Now, Under Article 14.1, it says that we have to look at the collective progress of the collective goals of the world itself. But the problem in this story are two very major sticking points. Now again, I'm trying to give you the larger perspective here, and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty. See, we know very straightforward and very well that when we talk about climate change, when we talk about global warming, India is not one of the major contributors. Our per capita emission is very, very low vis-a-vis, for example, even China is low vis-a-vis US. Historically also, we have not been the polluter. So therefore, India has always talked about common but differentiated responsibilities, wherein everybody has a different responsibility. Common goal is to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we already reached 1.1. We already know that the IPCC report has already said that it's a closing opportunity, it's a closing window in that sense. Now, two major sticking points were there. One, a perpetual one, which is climate financing, which still does not have a solution, which is if the world wants, or if the developed countries want, that India should go for a greener path is actually more expensive. And if it is more expensive, then somebody needs to finance it. I can build a thermal power plant in, for example, 100 crores, but if I have to develop a solar park, it needs at least 500 crores. So who will pay for that 400 crores? Now, that is the concept of climate financing, that developed countries who have historically actually been the real polluters should finance the developing countries and the least developed countries in that regard. They should create what is called the Green Climate Fund, and the concept was that $100 billion would be pushed year on year by the developed countries so as to finance green projects across the world. They have never reached that $100 billion, not even once, forget year on year. Now, this issue remains contagious. This will never actually get sorted because nobody wants to pay the bill. Rather, the second question which was created was the concept of pathway of transition, which the article calls transition pathway. Now, let's try to understand this because there is now a breakthrough with regards to the transition pathway. Now, what do you mean by transition pathway? For example, I am a $3 trillion economy, $3 trillion economy, and my pathway says that if I invest $100 billion in thermal and $5 billion in solar and $50 billion in wind, I can become 5 trillion economy by 2028, for example. This is an example I'm giving you. This is the pathway we've taken, that we are still investing in thermal, then solar, then wind. Now, this pathway is actually something which is suited to India because we have a lot of coal and it is the cheapest one. However, there is one more pathway which is 3 trillion economy, and the pathway is that we push $5 billion in thermal, but we have to push $100 billion in solar and wind, and we will have to push $500 billion in nuclear, and then we become $5 trillion economy by 2028. A and B. Which is a more just path or which is a more better path for a country like India? A or B? A or B? Which is a better path for India? See, A is the cheapest path, and if we go by our capacity right now, A should be the path we should take. But a lot of you are saying B should be there. Yes, why not? B is a more greener path, and is more climate friendly. Now, the point is, we should have the power to decide if we want to take A or B. we should not be pushed into B because it is compulsory for every country to do that. What I mean by that, if you have a problem with nuclear, I'll make it hydel power. Now is it okay? Yes. Nuclear waste, where will it go? It will not go anywhere. Now, try to understand the concept. What I mean to say is, A makes India a 5 trillion economy very quickly and cheapest path. On the other hand, this B path makes India 5 trillion economy, but in the most greenest way. Now this is called transition pathway. We have to transition and we have to reach a certain economic development. We should not be forced to take B and we should have the option to take A. And what they have called this is the concept of just transition path. Just and unjust in the sense that if a country does not have the capacity to go for a greener path, its economic development should not suffer because it does not have the capacity to put into greener projects. So the transition pathway should be just. And this is a very important concept which now has been introduced via these climate conferences, which can be asked in the examination. Wherein we know that climate financing, there is no clarity. Nobody is ready to pay this money. Second, there's the second issue, which is transition pathway. How do we transition from A to B economy in the greenest way possible? Development should not stop. But A is a path which is the cheapest for India, but is a little bit more polluting. But India needs it because in that creates more jobs, for example, and it is the best for our economy. We don't have to take debt. It is best for our economy. On the other hand, if we go by climate consciousness, we have to go with B, but B creates a major fiscal burden on India, and that nobody is ready to pay. So, for example, we become 5 trillion economy in both, but in one we have too much national debt or fiscal deficit is very, very high. In one it isn't. Now the point is about justness. We cannot be forced to take a path which the developed countries want us to take. This is a very important point you need to understand. Bonn already said that every country has to be ambitious. But you tell me one thing, if every American thinks that climate change does not exist, if their hurricanes and cyclones kills multiple people, if they are so dumb that they don't understand climate change itself, if they don't understand global warming and their politics is about denying climate change itself, why should you and me pay for that? Why should India not become a 5 trillion economy? Because those dumb people cannot reduce their per capita carbon emission or their carbon footprint. They will still use their very big pickup trucks, but they want India to become an EV economy, that everything should be what we call as electric vehicle. Why? Why should India not have that? This is the concept of justness and unjustness. Why should something which is happening in America or, for example, Europe is the historical emitter. Europe is the one who industrialized first. It is all the industrial revolution carbon emission which we are paying for. Now this is the problem. Now when you get a 32-degree British summer in which you have to go into water to survive, that is not my problem. We have been saying that climate change is happening. We as Indians, our nationally determined goals have been better. We have actually also reached close to 80% of what we have said we will go for renewable energy. When we are doing everything, then why can't you? Then we have no sympathy for you. If there are forest fires which are happening, that is your problem, because you are not ready to be ambitious when it comes to climate change. If people are dying of heat strokes there, learn that there is climate change. When it came to ozone depletion, and because it impacted Europe first, because the ozone layer starts from north to south, then in that sense you did everything. Montreal Protocol, one of the most successful treaties in the world, because now the ozone layer is healing itself. But when it came to global warming, which impacts the south first, which impacts the equatorial countries first, and it impacts from south to north, and in the northern hemisphere, in the temperate zone, it is having the least impact initially, you said there is nothing. Americans still don't believe that there is climate change. According to them, hurricanes are happening, extreme weather events are happening randomly. So very simply, before I go into the nitty-gritty, this is not written in the PPT. This is not given in the article also. I'm trying to give you a perspective. What the perspective I'm trying to give you here is that there has to be a just path. India's path has to be inclusive. It has to be sustainable. Also has to be something which India can pay for. And we don't have to die over something which the Americans are not ready to even understand. So the Republicans there, Trump, major climate denier. So for them the earth is also flat, so they are still caught up in the Middle Ages. So the simple point here is that the word which has been introduced now is the concept of just climate path. Just climate path is based on the concept that very simply the path has to be chosen by the country and it has to be just. So this word just, how you define it in the examination is very, very important. So I hope you understand the basic principle what is being pushed here. Everything else, I know the Europeans will never pay up. I know the Europeans will never ever pay this $100 billion generally, but year on year, they will make sure that only when New York goes underwater, they will believe that climate change exists. That too, they will, God we trust, they will say, no, nothing is happening. That is their problem. We as India have been performing very well when it comes to climate path. We have been doing a lot of things which they have not even touched. And we are transitioning towards solar. And if you have been following the WTO news, you know that we can produce solar panels at a much cheaper cost, but American countries have taken us to WTO saying that we are distorting the market. So you don't want us to go in that path also. So this developed and developing concept is very, very important in climate change. And therefore, developed countries have to pay up. If they are not ready to pay up, I would rather choose A. Because that makes India superpower more quickly at a less burden on the exchequer or on you and me. Because it is my taxes, it is your taxes which pays for this path. So we can't be the ones who pay for America's well-being of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they have always been hypocrites. We have to make sure that we do not fall into their hypocritical trap. We cannot fall into the hypocritical trap, that which is, the trap is very simple, that you do it, we will not do it. This we can't do. That is something which we don't agree with. We'll now move to the nitty-gritty of the topic, which is more technical. This was the basic point I wanted to make here. See, the core issues which were highlighted in the Bonn conference was that everybody needs to be more ambitious. But that doesn't mean that India needs to be ambitious. India has already been very ambitious when it comes to its basic emission targets, and we have actually reached them also. On the other hand, two basic agendas had become a sticking point. And the sticking point was mitigation pathway, which is compatible with global temperature and economic development, and climate financing. We know climate financing is still a sticky issue. Nobody wants to talk about it. So therefore, the point was that it's about a pathway which is just or unjust, has to be more compatible with everybody's economy. So on June 14th, the climate negotiators arrived at a compromise on one of the aspects, which is the concept of just transition pathway. Now, what is this concept of just transition pathway? Just transition pathway means a pathway which is inclusive, sustainable, according to the needs of the country. So, India's climate change principle has always been common but differentiated responsibility. Common responsibilities, we have to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius, but differentiated responsibility is the aspect of you pay more, we pay less. That is the basic point. And in the long term, India underlined the fact that financing has to be there for a just transition, and energy and transportation will not actually be something very cheap. As it is, if every Indian has to reduce his or her carbon footprint, we are buying what a car which is, for example, for 8 lakh rupees, we would have to pay more to go for an EV. So if we are ready as Indians to make sure that the world does not heat more, then why aren't the Europeans or the Americans? This dualistic behavior, this hypocritical behavior is something which has always been there, and we need to make sure that we call it out. That is the basic point. Now, what does this just transition mean? This is the core argument of this article. It means that the transformational pathway needs to be carried out in a fair, inclusive manner for everyone concerned. Therefore, India is concerned about the difficulties in going or recouping its economic development for greenhouse gas emissions. India has stated that the route of just transition needs to be clubbed up with means of implementation, which means that you can talk about transition, but if there is a technology in Europe which gives us more output from a solar panel, then you need to share it also. India cannot be doing R&D for new renewable energy. India can't be implementing it also. India cannot also be financing the transition. And you are just sitting there and giving us that solar panel at 3 times the cost. Then rather we would go for our own transition, which is just according to our understanding. So who decides what is this just? What is this concept of just is equally important. So I hope you understand this, that this just pathway is the most important concept which comes out of this article. Challenges still remain. Climate finance flows have not been the priority, though they should be the priority. When it comes to nationally determined goals, India had very ambitious nationally determined goals, but the Americans still have not reached even half of them. Thereafter, they argued that $100 billion had to come annually. Again, they've not even reached that 1 year. And at the end of the day, what the article points out is World Bank and IMF, and specifically World Bank, needs to get integrated into the climate financing concept, because then only they will pay up, and the principle of equity, justice and fairness needs to be followed. Now this is what you have to take away from here. The concept of just pathway, equity, fairness, and the concept of what is based on justice. No country should be forced to take a path which it cannot sustain. Clear, everyone? Yes. Okay. Now comes something which is coming out of America called greedflation. We know about stagflation, we know about inflation, deflation, creeping inflation, thisflation, thatflation. Now we have a new word which is coming out of America, which is the concept of greedflation. Now again, let me give you the basic argument. Though technically not true, Americans as it is make up their own stories. What the argument is coming out is very simple. That the multinational corporations during the pandemic, because of supply chain issues, increased prices. Happens. We know that when it comes to inflation, cost push inflation happens, wherein the input cost increases because there is certain issues with supplies. So input costs and what we call as cost push inflation is very common, nothing new in that regard. So supply chain issue was there during the pandemic, so MNCs increased their prices. Now what they are arguing is that the prices were increased not in proportion with the issues. For example, if the issue was that you increase it by 10 rupees, let's take it in dollars, why not, $10, then the prices were increased by $30. And even when the supply chain issues have gone, they are still greedy. So greedflation, which is prices are extremely high because of the greed of the multinational corporations. This is the basic argument, wherein yes, there were supply chain issues, yes, there was an increase in prices, but those increase in prices were not proportional to the issues which were there, and still when everything is perfect, they have still not decreased their prices, so they are basically profiteering. This is the basic argument which is there. Now there are 2-3 things which make this argument actually not work. First thing is that the market does not work like that. Firstly, inflation, you tell me, is general price rise or particular to a specific product? Come on, tell me. Is it A or B? Is it general price rise or it is particular to a product? Inflation as a concept. It is, very good, general. It is general price rise, wherein everything starts to show certain increase in prices. Now this argument does not stand basically because if certain MNCs, for example Nestle, is doing it, it does not mean that if just by Nestle increasing the prices, there's a price rise across the economy itself. So they are talking about a particular product and then saying that it is greedflation. Doesn't work like that. Because if the market is like that, there's competition in the market. So if they have increased by $30, for example, Cadbury, what it will do, it will say that they've increased by $30, let's decrease by $10 and bring it to $20 margin. This is called market. You want to sell your product as much as you want. And therefore, if you are selling your product at a very high price, then competition will automatically either take away your customers or you would have to give a discount because your product will not sell. So the problem is that this concept of greedflation does not stand the 2 basic tests of inflation. First, which is it general price rise? No, it's a particular price rise because you're talking about MNCs. And second, you are also talking about a market which is capitalistic, and if it is not controlled, competition will take away your customers. So this basically doesn't make sense in the larger perspective, as economists are saying, because greedflation is more about a political agenda which is there in America, which is talking about how these MNCs are too dominant and monopolistic. That is true, but greedflation makes no sense. But then the question is, how are they having so much profit? And the answer to that question is because during the pandemic, small suppliers and small companies actually closed, their customer base has increased, therefore their profits have increased. So very simply, if somebody says, what is greedflation? Greedflation is a politically motivated concept which has come from America, which talks about MNCs profiteering because they increase prices not proportional to the issues in the supply chain itself, and it is not cost push inflation because cost push inflation would impact everything. It would not impact just one sector or one product. It would impact everybody, and therefore the general price rise is not there, though inflationary trend is there, sure, because of their monetary policy, but that is not because MNCs are increasing prices. It is not that artificial. That is the basic point. Inflation is a much more inherent concept of macroeconomic trends rather than just 2-3 MNCs doing something. Just because an iPhone became 50,000 rupees more expensive does not mean that the whole core inflation, WPI, CPI, everything will start to show 10% increase. That will not happen, obviously. Because one product became expensive, people will stop buying the iPhone or they will find that money. So that does not have a concept of integrated economic development or integrated macroeconomic indicators. So this new trend of adding inflation to things makes no sense. Understand the basic core issue here? Because then I'll go into the nitty-gritty of the argument. This is the basic point. What is greedflation? How it does not stand. Okay, it does not stand because it's not making economic sense. Okay, so greedflation refers to the inflation caused by corporations and their greed for higher profits. Progressives in the United States have been arguing that corporates' greed was one of the major reasons for historically high prices. The Americans are so dumb that they don't understand that it is basically the Russia-Ukraine crisis which has created a problem in the global supply chain, further because of the fuel prices going up because of that crisis itself, which is leading to inflation. So their small mind can only understand one thing: if it is expensive, then the corporation is at fault, not the macroeconomic indicators. No issues. Okay. Thereafter, main argument. The proponents of this idea argue that greedflation, corporate profit margins have risen significantly since the pandemic. Even though the larger economy has struggled, their contribution to the inflation is extremely high. They contend that US corporations have allegedly increased the prices of their goods by more than what was necessary to compensate for higher input costs and supply chain bottlenecks. Now, proponents of greedflation theory see that it is a sign of increased market domination by corporations and had called for the concept of reigning market power and making these large corporations reduce their prices and prevent profiteering. So it's a totally artificial concept which they are saying that 2-3 corporations came together, said let's increase prices, and that led to inflation. Now, is it actually true? The argument which the economists say is no. This is more a political narrative which is rising out of America due to the rising inflation issue rather than actually a pure economic issue. How? Because greedflation narrative argues that businesses, whether they are large corporations or small companies, cannot arbitrarily set prices as many people seem to erroneously believe. The error in their understanding is that you cannot just fix a price and then sell it. Business set prices for their products on what the consumers are willing to pay, and therefore businesses cannot force consumers to pay a certain price for their goods. Because it is a market economy, they can try to gauge the maximum price a customer will pay for a certain product. If it is too high, then they will not buy that product, and rather somebody else will go and take away their consumers, and they would have to sell it at a lower price so as to clear the stock itself. So very simply, it makes no economic logic. Moreover, inflation is general price rise rather than particular to a specific product itself. So it cannot be about individual goods and services. The way corporations influence overall prices is mostly by reducing supply, which is cost push inflation, but the US corporations are not doing that. So why is there such a major, what we call as, margin for such things? There is such a big margin not because they have increased their profits. It's because during the pandemic smaller businesses closed, so their market share has increased. So very simply, before we move on to the Prelims Bytes section, we've discussed 3 very interesting articles. First, we discussed the NATO plus concept, how India has nothing to gain out of it, rather losing all-weather friend and losing its sovereignty when it comes to foreign and defense policy. On the other hand, we thereafter discussed the concept of the just transition pathway, which is every country should have the right to choose its pathway towards a greener future, and we should not be forced to do it. So therefore, equity, fairness and justice is something very important in climate change. They are not ready to pay. We will not change our path. We will take the best path for every Indian. We have to make sure that it is in our interest, not in the interest of the Americans. Last but not the least, again a concept which is coming out of America itself, greedflation, corporations manipulating prices, making everybody pay more, but they don't understand one thing, that inflation is more integrated into macroeconomic politics and macroeconomic trends rather than based on certain corporations. So it's a political narrative rather than just something which we should add to our list of inflation, deflation, recession and what we call a stagflation. Rather, it is a very politically motivated narrative which has been created. 3 basic things we've discussed. I hope these are clear. If they are, then we'll move to the 3 small topics we have to discuss. Yes? Okay. Now, first, very simple, and this is the irony of the story, that we are the ones who are taking a lot of Russian oil and by taking Russian oil, we have to pay the Russians in certain currencies. Now, Russia is under economic sanctions from the US. Its inflow of the dollar is extremely less, and as it is, it cannot trade with somebody else in dollars. And for a very long time, India has been, and this is called the de-dollarization of the world after the Russia-Ukraine crisis. India has been looking for alternative, what we call as currencies to pay the Russians. Now the problem is that we have a major trade deficit with Russia. So if we pay them in rupee, they can't do anything with that rupee because they don't trade with, we have a negative, what we call as balance with them. Therefore, the rupee surplus which Russia has, they can't do anything with that. US dollar inflow is not there only. So the biggest trade partner as of right now for Russia is actually China. And India and China both have actually found a way, or rather India and Russia have actually found a way to find a currency in which Russians can get their payments and they can use that payment in other places also. And therefore, the Chinese yuan has been chosen as a currency for which Russian imported oil is being paid for. And Moscow is finding it difficult to find generally dollar access, and it's trying to find alternatives to the settlement via currencies. And therefore, because of the different sanctions, India had to find a currency which works, and that is yuan. This makes a very interesting trilogy wherein India is paying Russia in yuan, and Russia thereafter is paying China in that yuan, for because their relationship here is negative, is positive, is negative, and here it is negative, it is positive. So therefore India is ready to pay them. Dollar has no place for Russians as of right now because they can't deal in dollar because of the economic sanctions. So a very interesting thing which has happened as of right now. Now thereafter, something which we already knew but we now have confirmation to it, is that the Balasore train tragedy happened because of human error, and it was because of the signaling issue. And very simply what the report says is that there was certain repair work which was happening on the signaling or signals sector, or Gumti as it is called. That signaling sector, there was something happening. They did not clear that issue, but still they passed a memorandum that the work was done. It was basically for a level crossing which was in a way not giving the right response, and error was there. And more than that, because they were in haste to complete that signaling issue, they did not realize that the main track was linked to the loop rather than going straight, which was one of the most dangerous things which happened, which is the primary cause of this basic tragedy, is a train getting into the loop where the malgadi was there or the goods train was there. So what it says is that it was human error in the triple train collision which happened. The argument which has been given, or the finding has been, that there was a level crossing issue at gate number 94, and on the ill-fated date the memorandum said that they are working on the signaling and the gate itself, and at 4:20 p.m. there were repairs which were happening. At 4:50 they issued a memorandum after reconnection was done, but the signaling issue was still there. And therefore, when Shalimar Express was given the green light, it should not have been given, because the track 17 AB was actually linked to the UP loop line rather than going straight. And that was all because of this major confusion which was created over what was the issue and how it was resolved. Very simply, the issue had not been resolved. Memorandum was passed that reconnection had happened, but reconnection actually had not happened. Therefore, they had very simply forgot in a way that this was into the loop line. This was correct. When the goods train came there, this 17 A and B, they put it into B. But then they started to work on this signal. And what happened was that they did not know that it was B rather than A for which the line was connected. We don't have to go into that. We'll see. But this is a human error, proper signaling issues with regards to how the what we call as track was pushed into the loop line rather than going straight. And this is the core issue, which is they were working on something in the haste of giving a green light. they did it that okay, everything is fine. It is related to a level crossing in that sense. And we already know that, we previously discussed it on this platform also. Last but not the least, 76% of all 2000 rupee notes have returned. So when on 19th May it was said that 2000 rupee notes, we would expect you to actually give back the denomination. We will give you 100 or 500. They want to take away the big denomination in that sense. Very simply, only 0.84 lakh crores is left in the economy. 2.72 crores, 2.72 lakh crores has come back, which was in circulation at this point of time, and that way it is encouraging, but still the number is very, very less, which is 76%. It has to reach 90%, then it makes sense. So still there's a lot of denomination in 2000, but very simply 76% has come back. Now before we move to the mains question, what have we done today? We discussed three very heavy topics. One based on NATO plus, how India doesn't gain anything from it. We discussed the concept of greedflation, if you want to say a make-believe concept made by the Americans. And third, the concept of just transition path, which is based on the concept of justice, equity, and the very simple fairness in transitionary path. Climate finance still remains an issue. Thereafter, 76% of all 2000 rupees notes have come in. Human error caused a major tragedy in India. And last but not the least, the yuan being the savior for India and Russia in the larger balance of trade. Now, with this, let's look at the mains question. The NATO model of collective security does not suit Indian foreign and defense policy. Comment. Very good question. GS paper 2 and 3, both you can see this type of question for internal security also, or be it for governance. What is greedflation? What are the dynamics behind this concept? Again, GS paper 3, you can practice. So, thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. I will see you very soon with another set of issues. Take care. Bye-bye.